Keep your babies close to you. There's someone out there.
Surreal images of the pageant star transfix the nation.
Were you a stage mother?
Probably. What's wrong with that?
No charges have ever been filed. Nobody ever convicted. Tonight, the theories, secrets, and bombshells.
Please, hurry. Patsy.
A CNN special report, The Murder of JonBenét.
The JonBenét Ramsey case has remained a haunting mystery for nearly 3 decades. Was there truly an outside intruder, or does the evidence point closer to home? Much of what was once accepted as fact has since been called into question. Today, we revisit this case alongside James Kohler, a former lead investigator who re-examined every element, from the ransom note and DNA findings to the hidden secrets within the Ramsey household. JonBenét Ramsey, a 6-year-old child beauty pageant contestant, was found dead in the basement of her family's Boulder, Colorado home on December 26, 1996. A bizarre ransom note, unidentified DNA, and the family's questionable behavior raised suspicion, but investigators found no definitive signs of forced entry. Nearly 30 years later, no suspect has ever been charged, and the case remains unsolved. In 2006, James Kohler, a seasoned law enforcement officer with over 20 years of investigative experience and former chief investigator in the Telluride Police Department, was assigned to conduct a full reevaluation of the case for the Boulder District Attorney's Office. His methodical, detail-oriented approach challenged long-standing assumptions and reshaped how many viewed the evidence. Kohler later published his findings in his book, Foreign Faction: Who Really Kidnapped JonBenét, which questioned the intruder theory and suggested that the truth might have been deliberately obscured to protect someone within the household. His analysis examined the ransom note, the DNA evidence, family behaviors, and even overlooked details in the crime scene, all with the aim of exposing inconsistencies hidden beneath years of media spin and official silence. Unlike others who avoided openly scrutinizing the Ramsey family, Kohler directly confronted contradictions. His investigation revealed that much of what had been interpreted as signs of an outside intruder could instead point inward, raising the question, could this case have been solved long ago if inconvenient truths had not been buried? Kohler's work stood out not only for his conclusions, but for his process. He reviewed over 60,000 pages of reports, witness statements, autopsy results, forensic analyses, crime scene photographs, and even video recordings. He reconstructed the case from the ground up, carefully comparing every claim against the physical evidence. One striking discovery involved the injuries on JonBenét's body. While earlier investigators suggested they were caused by a stun gun, Kohler compared them to marks from a toy train set found inside the Ramsey home, and the spacing matched. This and other findings chipped away at the foundation of the intruder theory. He also re-examined the ransom note, the alleged point of entry, the supposed stun gun evidence, and even the much-discussed boot print near the body. Each detail, when scrutinized, seemed less like proof of an outside attacker and more like evidence of staging. From undisturbed spiderwebs at the entry point to misidentified footprints, Kohler dismantled the intruder narrative piece by piece. His conclusion was blunt. It was highly unlikely an intruder committed the crime. But if not an outsider, then who inside the house was being shielded? Kohler also criticized the 2008 decision by District Attorney Mary Lacey to publicly clear the Ramsey family based on trace DNA fragments found on JonBenét's clothing. He argued that such reliance on low-level mixed DNA evidence was premature and dangerously misleading, particularly since no other signs of an outside presence, fingerprints, foreign fibers, or forced entry, were ever found. For Kohler, the case was not just about reinvestigating evidence, but about exposing how politics, media narratives, and institutional hesitation may have obscured the truth. His work continues to challenge the official story and keeps alive the question, was the truth about JonBenét Ramsey hidden in plain sight, inside her very own home? If an entire case was to rest solely on ambiguous genetic traces, then what was being done with all the other evidence? James Kohler didn't just challenge Mary Lacey's conclusions, he dismantled them. In his 2009 presentation, he explained that after the arrest of John Mark Carr, he tried to push the state toward reconvening a grand jury by presenting new evidence that had never been made public. When those efforts stalled, he faced a sobering realization. He later reflected, "I never imagined writing about this case if I believed prosecution was still possible. But once I realized no charges would ever be filed, I felt it was important to reveal information that had been hidden from the public or known only to a few law enforcement officials. I wanted to share what I believed was a larger truth about the investigation and the new evidence uncovered." Through this exhaustive dissection of the files, Kohler exposed truths long buried beneath official statements and political decisions. He argued that focusing on one thread while ignoring the rest of the fabric would only distort the case. He didn't just review prior work. He reconstructed the entire investigative framework line by line, frame by frame, stripping away institutional bias. In cold case investigations, such rigor is rare, even revolutionary. One major point of contention was the ransom note. Because Patsy Ramsey could not be excluded as its author, handwriting experts and linguists alike suggested her involvement could not be ruled out. That infamous letter, supposedly a demand for JonBenét's safe return, became a central puzzle. Yet, under Kohler's scrutiny, the note didn't read like a kidnapper's plea. At 2.5 pages long, it remains one of the longest ransom notes ever recorded in a kidnapping. Real ransom notes are usually terse, direct, and urgent. This one rambled, quoted movies, and contradicted itself. More suspiciously, it was written with pen and paper from inside the Ramsey home, specifically Patsy's notepad and a ballpoint pen found in the kitchen. There was no sign of haste. Drafts were even discovered. Kohler analyzed every element, from tone and word choice to punctuation. The most striking clue was the dollar figure, $118,000. This was not a rounded demand, but the exact amount of John Ramsey's recent Christmas bonus, a detail only someone inside or very close to the family would know. Kohler argued this was not coincidence, but intention, a breadcrumb planted to steer suspicion. The note's theatrical tone, phrases like, "We are a small foreign faction," or "Don't try to grow a brain," seemed less like the voice of a hardened criminal and more like someone mimicking Hollywood thrillers. To Kohler, the letter felt staged, designed not to extort, but to construct a narrative, a performance meant to mislead from the start. If the ransom note was the smoke, then DNA had long been treated as the fireproof alibi. For years, the Ramseys' defenders pointed to genetic evidence on JonBenét's clothing and body as proof of an outsider's involvement. But Kohler warned, relying solely on this evidence would mean accepting the implausible scenario that up to 6 unidentified people handled different items tied to the murder, all without leaving fingerprints, fibers, or being seen. When Kohler examined the DNA evidence in detail, the picture grew far less certain. The most widely discussed was trace male DNA on JonBenét's underwear and Long John's, tested in 2003 and again in 2008. While it excluded the Ramsey family and close relatives, it also matched no one in the FBI's CODIS database. To the public, this seemed like exoneration. To Kohler, it was ambiguity, DNA that didn't belong to the family, but didn't lead to any suspect either. Additional DNA was found under JonBenét's fingernails in 1997. Again, it matched no known person. But the samples were degraded and partial, trace fragments, not a definitive genetic profile. Moreover, these sequences were consistent with the DNA from her underwear, suggesting a common but unknown source. Further samples recovered in 2008 from the garrote and wrist cords revealed more male DNA, yet different from the profile in the underwear. The bindings and garrote matched each other, but not the earlier samples. If taken as proof of an intruder, this implied multiple unidentified males had left DNA across the crime scene while leaving no other trace. To Kohler, this didn't support innocence. It revealed unreliable interpretation. He argued that declaring exoneration based on such fragmentary evidence was dangerously premature. If a case is built on microscopic debris, then all inconsistencies must also be addressed. In this case, the DNA didn't point to a suspect. It pointed to uncertainty. And uncertainty, Kohler insisted, is not exoneration. It is a void. This was his most controversial and critical position. While the public clung to the unknown DNA as the ultimate cipher, Kohler asked the uncomfortable question: what if the DNA doesn't matter in the way people think it does? In Foreign Faction, Who Really Kidnapped JonBenét, he dismantled the assumption that the genetic traces belonged to the killer. Instead, he argued for a far more mundane but deeply unsettling explanation. The DNA may have had nothing to do with the crime at all. He pointed out that touch DNA, like the male profile on JonBenét's underwear, is not a blood or saliva sample, but merely shed skin cells. Such fragments could easily have been transferred during garment production, from factory workers, packaging contamination, or ordinary household contact. In other words, the DNA long treated as the smoking gun may have been irrelevant background noise all along. In today's world, where traces of our genetic material are constantly left behind on doorknobs, furniture, and even clothing tags, the simple presence of touch DNA cannot automatically be taken as proof of guilt. In fact, in this case, it may have meant nothing at all. The real problem was complexity. The DNA found on JonBenét's underwear wasn't a clear, single-source profile. Instead, it was a mixture that contained genetic markers from at least 2 unidentified individuals. That rendered it almost meaningless as a tool for either exclusion or confirmation. Rather than pointing to one definitive suspect, it added yet another layer of ambiguity to a case already clouded by mistakes and speculation. Kohler viewed this not as a clue, but as a distraction. He also highlighted a fact often overlooked in surface-level retellings. No foreign DNA was discovered on the most critical areas of the body or on key crime scene objects. Nothing on the ligature, nothing on the garrote handle, nothing on JonBenét's neck, the very place where she was strangled. If an unknown intruder had committed the crime with bare hands and tools brought from outside, one would expect at least some trace left behind. Yet there was nothing. To Kohler, that absence was more damning than any partial profile. It suggested that the DNA evidence had been misinterpreted, even exaggerated, at the expense of context. His sharpest critique came when addressing former District Attorney Mary Lacy's 2008 decision to publicly exonerate the Ramsey family, based solely on that single DNA profile. To Kohler, and to a growing number of independent experts, that move wasn't just premature, it was scientifically unsound. As reported by the Daily Camera and 9 News in 2016, multiple specialists questioned how Lacy could ignore the presence of multiple contributors, treat a mixed sample as definitive, and draw sweeping conclusions that effectively ended scrutiny of the family. To Kohler, this wasn't just a mistake. It was a misrepresentation of the evidence, one that steered the entire case into a dead end built on the illusion of certainty. And that was his central warning. When investigators place blind faith in inconclusive science, they stop asking the right questions. They stop looking inward. They stop noticing what remains in plain sight. Then came one of his most unsettling revelations. In 2016, nearly 2 decades after JonBenét's death, Advances in forensic testing allowed for ultra-sensitive reanalysis of the physical evidence using next-generation methods. The results were startling. 6 different disrupted DNA profiles, each from separate unknown individuals, were detected on items including JonBenét's underwear, long johns, the wrist ligature, and even paint from the broken brush used to construct the garrote. Crucially, none of these profiles matched each other, nor did they match the previously publicized unknown male 1 profile that had fueled the intruder theory for years. To Kohler, this wasn't just a wrinkle, it was a reckoning. If a single intruder had committed the crime, how could 6 separate, unrelated DNA contributors be explained? The only logical conclusion was contamination. DNA transferred during manufacturing, handling, or later evidence management. If that were true, then the entire foundation for the intruder theory collapsed under its own contradictions. As Kohler bluntly stated, investigators had elevated the presence of random DNA above all other evidence, and in doing so, had lost sight of the bigger picture. And that loss, he believed, was no accident. In his book Foreign Faction, Kohler directly challenged the intruder theory long championed by retired detective Lou Smit and embraced by the Ramsey defense. While Smit painted a picture of a stealthy predator slipping through the basement window to carry out a sadistic assault, Kohler dismantled the scenario point by point. He noted that the window showed no sign of forced entry. The spiderwebs in the window remained fully intact. The footprints and debris patterns were inconsistent with a break-in, and beyond that, the basement window was easily visible from outside and located in a little-used part of the house, an implausible choice for a stranger without intimate knowledge of the property. Instead, Kohler suggested something darker, that the crime scene had been staged, an artificial reconstruction designed to mislead investigators from the very start. The ransom note was unusually long and theatrical, and written on paper from the Ramsey home. The garrote had been fashioned from Patsy's art brush. Even the cord binding JonBenét's wrists matched materials already inside the house. Taken separately, these details might be coincidences. Taken together, they pointed to intent and to staging. If the tools of the crime had been collected from inside the home, and if items had been handled carefully, then the lack of Ramsey family DNA might not prove innocence, but rather suggest deliberate removal. For Kohler, the absence of evidence wasn't exculpatory. It was potentially strategic, especially if the perpetrators had the time, knowledge, and motive to construct a false narrative before police ever arrived. What began as a DNA puzzle became, in Kohler's hands, a blueprint for misdirection. What looked like the randomness of a violent outsider began instead to resemble something far more intimate and unsettling. And nowhere was this clearer than at the infamous basement window well. Long considered the key entry point in Lou Smit's intruder theory, Kohler found it not just flawed, but physically impossible. His reason? A spiderweb. In the lower right corner of the basement window, the very spot Smit claimed an intruder had slipped through, there remained a small triangular spiderweb, untouched, not even partially disturbed. In crime scene analysis, such a detail is explosive. That single fragile web stood as a silent witness, contradicting the story of an intruder entering through the window without leaving a trace. It wasn't just the web. Shards of broken glass still rested on the window ledge, exactly where someone would have placed a hand or knee to crawl through. Those jagged pieces were undisturbed, frozen in place, when they should have fallen or shifted if anyone had actually passed through. To test this, Kohler's team worked with criminal behavior analyst Laura Richards during the 2016 CBS docuseries The Case of JonBenét Ramsey. They built a life-size replica of the basement window. Laura, the smallest member of the team, attempted to crawl through. Even with full preparation, she couldn't pass without breaking the web and displacing the surrounding debris. The conclusion was undeniable. The window had not been used. And with that, one of the central pillars of the intruder theory crumbled into dust. The evidence was clear. No one entered through that basement window. The spiderwebs, dust, and glass fragments remained undisturbed, directly contradicting Lou Smith's intruder reenactment. For James Kohler, the crime scene spoke plainly. The intruder theory had collapsed. Attention then turned to JonBenét's fatal injury, a skull fracture nearly 9 inches long. On the kitchen counter sat a Maglite flashlight, wiped clean of prints. Kohler's experiments showed the wound matched the flashlight's casing almost perfectly. This suggested not an outsider, but a possible household accident, perhaps Burke, in a moment of anger or carelessness, striking his sister. The silence that followed could have triggered panic, leading to a cover-up born of desperation, not malice. The stun gun theory also unraveled. Kohler compared JonBenét's marks with real stun gun wounds and found no match. More importantly, stun guns cause pain and screams, hardly the weapon of a stealth intruder. Instead, a chilling alternative emerged. The abrasions aligned with tracks from Burke's toy train. The injuries were likely domestic, not inflicted by a stranger. Even the high-tech boot print in the basement proved inconclusive. While real, it could have come from police or responders rather than an intruder. Time and again, Kohler showed that evidence once thought to point outward instead turned back toward the home. Kohler found that the high-tech boot print in the wine cellar was likely left by law enforcement, not an intruder. It was a single, isolated mark with no stride or disturbance in the dusty floor, evidence of contamination, not entry. The basement window intruder theory also collapsed. John Ramsey admitted breaking it months earlier. On the night of the crime, spiderwebs, dust, and leaves were untouched, and the suitcase beneath showed no signs of use. Kohler's tests proved no one could have entered without leaving clear disruption. The scene looked staged, not broken into. This turned focus inward. The ransom note, long, theatrical, demanding John's exact bonus amount, suggested inside knowledge. Handwriting experts were divided, but Kohler highlighted its cinematic tone and improbable details. Patsy, who found the note and called 911, never mentioned JonBenét by name and appeared to steer suspicion toward an intruder. Kohler didn't accuse directly, but he argued the note and behavior showed planning, not panic, crafted to control the story before morning. Patsy Ramsey was the first awake, aware, and in control of the ransom note, a performance that set the tone for what followed. Kohler argued the morning wasn't chaos, but control, beginning with the staged note and ending with John's precise discovery of JonBenét's body in a hidden basement room no one else had checked. His actions, lifting the body, disturbing evidence, planning a same-day flight, suggested strategy, not shock. Kohler's theory shifts focus inward. The ransom note, broken window, and intruder story were deliberate misdirection. Enhanced 911 audio hinted Burke was awake, contradicting the official account. Kohler proposed a tragic accident. Burke, just 9, striking JonBenet in frustration with a flashlight, followed by a desperate cover-up by the parents. The evidence, though inconclusive due to contamination and media chaos, consistently points to a domestic accident hidden by calculated staging. Kohler didn't claim certainty, but reframed the question, not who broke in, but how the family contained a tragedy. In his view, the hardest truth may be that the answers were always inside the Ramsey home.